Welcome to Beating Sisyphus, a production of the Canizares Center for Emerging Markets in collaboration with the Cornell Emerging Markets Institute Club, live from Ithaca, New York. My name is Thomas Riveros, and I'm the co-host of the podcast, along with Lourdes Casanova, who is the director of the Canizares Center. Beating Sisyphus brings together leaders from across economics, technology, finance, policy, and entrepreneurship to explore how innovation emerges under pressure. And today, we're honored to welcome on the program Salim Furth. Salim is a senior research fellow and director of the Urbanity project at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. An expert on the regulatory barriers to growth, he frequently advises local governments and testifies before state and federal legislatures on housing and zoning reform. He earned his PhD in economics from the University of Rochester. Salim, it's an honor to have you on today.
Oh, thank you, Thomas. It's great to be here.
Okay, so Salim, you studied economics and ended up obsessed with land use, which is very important for the development of any country. What was the specific moment you realized that was your passion and why?
Yeah, great question. So I had a bit of a journey. So I studied developing countries at University of Rochester under Mark Aguirre, who's now a professor at Princeton, and got a job working in the sort of the think tank sector in Washington, where I was actually primarily focused on U.S. macroeconomics, a little bit the sort of the European financial crisis. But so that sort of moved me from international to domestic macro. But my supervisors there, their interpretation of macroeconomics was just like, all the economics that, study whatever you want. And so I was starting to work, we did a lot of work around unemployment. This was, during the long shadow of the global financial crisis. And in the US, unemployment was the number one issue. But, maybe come 2014, 2015, things on the employment front were improving. And I realized it was time to pivot a little bit to other kind of macroeconomic concerns that were going to be politically important. And I correctly predicted that affordability was going to be an issue, cost of living. And so I started to work on a project about that. And all I wanted to do was collect a bunch of existing estimates, right? So like, here are some different, poorly designed regulations that cost people money. And a lot of them are bad regulations, but they're trivial, right? So like US sugar tariffs and quotas, double the price of sugar for American consumers. But even doubling the price of sugar, you just buy so little sugar annually as a percentage of your budget. It just isn't hurting people that much, right? Yeah, it's bad policy. It's, kind of cartelist that obviously hurts sugar producing countries more than it hurts American consumers because of the wealth difference. But, you say, okay, maybe you're going to save $20, $50 a year if we got rid of these sugar quotas. But then you come to housing regulation, right? And housing is the biggest portion of almost everyone's budget. And housing regulations are very strict. I thought, okay, this is going to be big. But I could not find an academic estimate that I could say, like, this is the average cost of regulations on housing to the consumer. And I said, well, come on, this is really important. Somebody should be studying this. And but there were some different data sets, et cetera. And I said, well, okay, I'm a good economist. I can come up with an estimate, at least to start the conversation. And, one regression led to another. And, pretty soon I was spending a third of my time, studying, what are the measurements of barriers, housing supply inelasticity, which means like the inability of the private market to respond to price increases. So we say a market is elastic if a price increase leads to lots more quantity growth, right? So prices rise and lots more housing is built. We say it's inelastic if prices rise and not much more housing is built. So, that's kind of, I started spending more and more of my time in Mercatus. Maybe a couple of years after that said, hey, why don't you come and do that full time here? And so that was 8 years ago. And I've had a fantastic run working mostly on US land use policy and both studying, doing the academic side, studying how housing markets work and exploring these different elasticities. And then a lot of my work is on the policy side, working with legislators who want to bring housing within reach of more citizens, as especially post-COVID, prices rose quite a bit in real terms. And there's a, affordability crisis is now, I think a commonplace phrase in the housing discourse.
Housing is, of course, so important for the development of emerging markets. So first food, then education, and then, of course, housing. And it's so important that you own something. And here in this country, absolutely the same. And around Ithaca, you can see that in some towns, definitely this is a major, major challenge for the citizens of upstate New York. So what is the economic foundation for thinking about housing and land use in general from both the supply and demand sides?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so there's a little paper that some Cornell student wrote years ago about Trumansburg, New York, which is a village up Route 96. And it's actually, so what's really interesting here is that for all the differences between, a rural small town US market and, a city like Lagos or Bombay, they have essentially the same problem, which is that the regulations put in place by the government are so strict that they're unrealistic. So Trumansburg, of course, like most US villages, was built before zoning was implemented, right? It was just kind of built along conventional lines. There might have been some regulations that were primarily aimed at preventing the spread of fires, right? If you're building in wooden houses, you worry about the spread of fire. There might have been some regulations of the disposal of sewage water, which is, again, reasonable and the kind of thing that has a direct public health concern. Later on, after Trumansburg was built, well-meaning urban planners came in from, wherever, the big city, and said, hey, wouldn't you like to have zoning? And just like almost every other US town, they implemented zoning and said, okay, we're going to slap on a bunch of regulations. And they kind of copied and pasted some regulatory code and made slight adjustments to bring it into Trumansburg. But it didn't fit Trumansburg. And it imposed lot sizes that were bigger than the existing lot sizes. It imposed rules on setbacks that were bigger than the existing setbacks. And so it effectively made illegal most of the traditional village. And this has been played out again and again all over the US. There's a big debate at another, village near Ithaca, Caroline, town of Caroline, just a few years ago, had a big public debate. My friend Nolan Gray made a documentary. He visited as a guest of some of the citizens of Caroline and made a documentary about should we implement zoning in this rural town. And I think what's missed by a lot of the proponents of regulation is that zoning normally comes into existing communities and makes the things they're already doing illegal. And it usually allows them, says, well, it's okay, you can keep doing what you're doing. But that actually creates nuisances because then you can't make slight adjustments to your business practice. You can keep your business practice. If you have a farm that does some things that aren't actually allowed under the new zoning, you can keep doing that, but you can't make a little adjustment. You can't build a new barn or a new shed or something if it doesn't fit with the new zoning. If you're in a place like Trumansburg, you have to jump through hoops to renovate your house or add a deck or make an addition, the kinds of things that people normally and appropriately do on their property. And so now take this to emerging markets. So if you're in a place like Lagos, you've got these regulations that are totally unrealistic. They are borrowed from Western models. They are well-meaning, extremely ignorant, but well-meaning in the sense that they would imagine that everyone can be middle class. Like if only we ban poverty, then everyone will become middle class. So we will say, in order to build a legal house, you have to have so many square meters of floor space. You have to have such and such type of, water and sewer. And so whatever rules they impose, these are imposed by typically Western educated citizens, natives, who bring back these ideals. And I don't know, there's cognitive dissonance. I don't think anybody imposing them thinks that they're actually going to be followed, but they wish that it were. And they want to say, our cities are bad. What we should have is cities that look like the suburbs of London or, a Dutch village or something that's just a totally unrealistic model. Maybe it reflects where they went to college. They come back from Ithaca. Let's impose, if we just impose the right regulations, then Lagos will look like Ithaca and it'll be, leafy and low rise and uncrowded. And now the effects, so the problem is the same in Trumansburg and in Lagos. The effect is completely different because in Trumansburg, the police power is executed vigorously. And if you try to break the zoning laws, you'll be fined. And, if you actually just built something illegal, it would be bulldozed. Unless it's small enough that you can kind of hide it. Like farmers break zoning laws all the time because you kind of can't see what they're doing. In Lagos, people just ignore the law and build outside of conventions. What this leads to is undersupply, right? So there's some amount of housing that people would like to have in each area. And not every place city is growing, of course, but if you think about places where there's a lot of jobs, maybe a lot of people want to retire there, or there's really beautiful natural amenities. So there's a lot of demand to live there, but they have these regulations that make it onerous to build a new house. And so the prices of existing houses rise. And so in the US, this expresses itself through unaffordability. In Lagos, it expresses itself through informality. So instead of being able to build a new subdivision of very small, simple dwellings for working class people who are, maybe at the 50th, or 25th income percentile in the country, which is a lot of people, and have those legally recorded and give people a clear legal right to their dwelling. They're frequently developed informally because you can't get the permits outside of the regulatory system, but you can just build. And most developing world cities have at least some districts where informal housing and other construction is tolerated. Sometimes you'll get bulldozers. Those are I've seen that happen in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. Where neighborhoods have been built and bulldozed, near formal but not quite formal, and that informality is a real cost. It makes it people hesitant to invest because they don't have clear ownership. So they're kind of going to put the minimum into their durable capital, their house, their structure, their business, because they could lose it if something bad happened. They can't, mortgage it and get access credit against their capital because it's not the title is not very clear. And different countries, different things, different patterns evolve around these kinds of norms that are semi-legal or kind of below the formal law. And then you've got a small upper crust of society that's able to live within the law and access better legal protection from the government. And so you get, again, same problem, but a very different outcome. And this is something I've actually just been thinking about this month because one of my friends, Patrick Lamson Hall, who works at the Urban Extension Project in Sub-Saharan Africa, is thinking about importing the YIMBY, yes, in my backyard concept from North America to Africa. And I thought, well, that doesn't seem appropriate. But, he explained it. I was like, oh, okay, I see. It's a different problem. But if the cause is the same, then maybe this concept of liberalization of regulation can be harnessed and kind of move across these very different spheres.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so it seems to me, like you said, zoning in both contexts, in the emerging market context and the developed nation context, is very in terms of housing supply, but like you said, there are two different avenues through which it takes. So, in the developed world, we tend to follow those regulations, or at least be able to enforce them, so people have to follow them. In underdeveloped nations, it's lower enforcement, and like you said, you have this informal side coming in. When you think about the overall economy level impacts of either of those, which one do you see kind of as more pernicious to overall, economic growth? A lot of people argue, in the context of emerging markets, where you have, kind of going around these dumb regulations is sometimes seen as, a more efficient way of doing things, because, you can kind of, since they're not enforced, in a sense, they're not as negatively impactful. But what do you think about when you think about comparing those two in terms of the impact on, overall growth?
That's a great question. I think it's really hard to sort of take either one out of its context. Right. So in the US, we're seeing strict land use regulations in the context of a highly litigious society where people do years and years of, redundant environmental reviews before they, put in solar panels or some, like simple thing. Right. And so you could change the land use policy, but if you don't change this other stuff, so it's very embedded in the same way in emerging markets, developing economies. You're embedding the regulations in a context where there's a whole world of this kind of like I think what my colleague Shruti Rajagopalan calls premature imitation. There's a better word than that, but basically borrowing developed world models before you're actually ready for those to be helpful. So I work with Alain Berthaud, we'd hoped could join us today, who's a really brilliant, fascinating guy who's worked all over the world. And one of his big messages is that developing world cities, bigger cities, they all want to do comprehensive plans, which is something that is imposed by law in the US. All 50 states require their municipalities to do comprehensive plans. And they also kind of come from this like high modernist idea. So like, you saw this in like the Soviet Union would have 5-year plans for their whole economy. And there's different versions of that in different political systems. But the idea of the modernists was, when things just happen on their own, it's chaotic and bad. And if only someone could harness all that energy in a single mind, they could make the economy work better. Well, that's enormously, enormously wrong. And of course, killed millions and millions of people in the hands of authoritarians. In democratic countries, it was much less harmful because we never actually gave one person that power to try to implement the plan. We just did the exercise of writing the plan and then put it on a shelf. But in developing world economies, it's worse because it's not just a waste of time, it's expensive. Because usually you have to bring in a global consultant. If you're a big city, you bring in a global consultant and you spend all this money to do a 10 or 20-year plan. And then conditions change so fast. Again, for emerging markets, they're changing much faster than developing world cities, which, went through that process maybe in the 19th century of extremely rapid growth and change. And so the plan is doubly useless because by the time it's written, it's already out of date. It's the regulations, the rules aren't enforced, let alone enacted. And you spent a large amount of money and kind of distracted your entire government apparatus around the plan. So Alain's argument is that instead of doing planning, you should be doing constant monitoring, which you're able to do in-house, right? So a large city should have a mixed discipline staff within urban planning. It's not just planners. That includes engineers, economists, et cetera, people who can understand how the city is working, and then work more around a set of indicators, right? So you want to be monitoring traffic speed in your downtown, monitor the housing costs compared to income. Then obviously things that aren't so urban planning, like crime rates, you can kind of apply the same logic. You should be seeing how things are going and then responding accordingly. So if you say, wow, commute times are rising really rapidly on the east side of our city, maybe we need some more investment there. And let's think about, what are our transportation options that could potentially reduce congestion. Or if you see home prices rising a lot, you can say, okay, why is this? Does this have to do with construction costs? Is it land scarcity? Is it our regulations? And so you're being more responsive. And interestingly, the place where this idea has taken off the most is Porto Alegre in Brazil. So southern Brazil, I mean, it's a huge country, but relatively close to Uruguay. And Alain has gone there several times, to the point that the different political parties that kind of vie for the mayoralty of Porto Alegre argue about which of them is more faithfully carrying out Monsieur Berthaud's ideas. And so they're trying, and they've had some major challenges. I don't know if you recall, about a year ago, they suffered a massive flood. And so Alain was actually flown in maybe a month after the flood via a military airport. And there's just a fantastic establishment. It's one of the, for a city that most people around the world have not heard of, it has one of the most interesting little ecosystems of urban planners, architects, who are doing really cutting edge work. There's a institute there, Institute for Responsive Cities. Of course, the name is in Portuguese, which is kind of tied into that ecosystem. And so they are dealing with the real world challenges of a city that's facing climate change and kind of difficult built position. It was, maybe not the best location for a city. And there's a rebuilding effort, but also thinking about, okay, how do we manage our growth in a way that is responsive rather than prescriptive? And so I love the work they're doing. I got to visit Porto Alegre with Alain 2 years ago before the flood. And, I think those ideas are spreading through Brazil and hopefully more so in Latin America.
Yeah, what an incredible story. I've actually had the pleasure of flying through Porto Alegre, so I know it's a very, very interesting, very cool place. I'd love to certainly be able to go visit more. I've done more to Uruguayana and Brazil. So we usually go through there to go to Uruguayana. So that's what a very cool connection there.
Yeah.
Indeed. So and you know, I really like what you mentioned there, you know, which was really like managing the growth responsibly rather than like prescriptively, and kind of letting, you know, those market forces enter in, and as opposed to like directing where resources need to go. I think, you know, on general level, like, you know, that's why free markets work so well, is because you're letting individuals determine what they want to do with their own resources, and they ultimately are able to make the best decisions for themselves and use those resources effectively. So, you know, I wanted to then get on to the idea, and one of the issues going on with affordability, um, and kind of understand what is, you know, happening globally. Do you see kind of a global affordability crisis in general, or is it mostly kind of in the U.S.? I know a lot of your work pertains to the U.S., but, you know, looking at a lot of like international data, um, you know, cross country data does seem to point to the fact that, especially after the pandemic, housing prices have risen pretty substantially.
Yeah, there's been a really interesting phenomenon in the last 20 years where relative housing prices in English speaking or English common law countries have risen much faster than in comparable developed world countries. So I think in, you know, the early 2000s, affordability was worse, say, in the Netherlands than in the US. And that's reversed. Part of that is a positive that the English speaking world, England aside, the English speaking world has had a stronger economy. The continent and Europe had a pretty weak recovery from the global financial crisis and has kind of bumbled along. They are facing competition and high-end manufacturing from China. Japan obviously has had a really challenging 30 years at this point. So the positive is, well, there's a lot of demand for housing and higher incomes. That's part of what's going on in the Anglosphere. The negative is that it seems like Anglosphere institutions are less agile or more prone to sort of sclerosis or rigidity. And I think it's an open question of why that is. Some has to do with the court system, right? We send a lot more things in the British tradition. We send a lot more things through the courts. And so that can create a situation where you want to build a high-speed rail line in California, and instead of worrying about the engineering, you're worried about lawyers. And you're spending a huge amount of time dealing with these little trivial complaints because people will use the courts as a negotiating tactic, right? So I'm going to jam your project up for 3 years in court as a way to extract concessions. And that's extremely costly, not only to the people involved, but to society, which depends on, you know, whether it's housing, rail, highways, like whatever you're building. Like the point was that this was going to benefit the world, not just your particular project. And so Elaine and I are actually heading off to Australia and New Zealand in 3 weeks. And those countries are maybe a little bit, I'd say probably comparable to Canada, a little bit more responsive and aggressive in policy than the US, but they're still dealing with extremely high prices. They also have, especially Australia and Canada, really, really high rates of immigration. So they have succeeded in attracting talent from all over the world, especially increasingly from Asia. That's the positive. The negative is if you don't build houses for your immigrants, then your prices go up. And so the housing growth rate in Australia is significantly higher than the US, but they're chasing a higher target because of immigration. And, you know, that has led to some predictably negative political consequences as well, right? Where there's anti-immigrant sentiment, and it's not, you know, you're not wrong at some level, right? Like there are a large number of people competing for the same set of resources, and if you aren't making enough for everyone, then it becomes a nasty game of musical chairs, and it's some pushing and shoving as to who's going to sit on the floor. And so if you want housing in a developed world context like that to be attainable by everyone, you've got to have more chairs so that the game of musical chairs doesn't leave anybody out. So yeah, there's a good question. Now, what's interesting is I think India, among emerging markets, is probably one of the worst off, in part because it inherited British institutions. And so the Indian planning law is among the most restrictive in the developing world. It was modeled closely on the British 1947 Town and Country Planning Act, and it's just very, very restrictive. It does not contemplate a lot of individual freedom. That's sort of combined then with the sort of socialist license raj that restricted Indian business growth up to 1991. So I mentioned my colleague Shruti Rajagopalan. So she leads the 1991 project, and kind of a research project to understand, do a lot of oral histories of the big liberalization in India that allowed for India to, really emerge as an emerging market, starting in the 90s. And then honestly, you layer on top, this is maybe impolite to talk about, but you layer on top of the official government regulation, some pretty unpleasant caste and religious-based discrimination in the Indian context. So if you want to buy a rent, or, people typically buy an apartment as opposed to renting it, in a building, you have to get a no objection certificate from the other inhabitants of the building, who are essentially saying, like, is this person of a sufficiently matching caste and religion that we are willing to live with them? And you will get buildings that are segregated on the basis of vegetarianism, right? So vegetarians don't want the smell of meat cooking in their building, which I understand. But on the other hand, like, like in the US, you would not be able to legally do that. These no objection certificate is something that Indians take as a matter of course, and that is a kind of a back door for caste discrimination, which is technically illegal, but functionally everywhere. And so Elaine and I were in Ahmedabad in Gujarat, and coming face to face with the both religious and caste discrimination, I was quite shocked, and that obviously holds individuals back. Unpleasant is violence, direct harm to people, but also holds people back from passively from being able to build their own lives and better themselves.
Yeah. Yes. Certainly a hard state there for a lot of people, for sure.
Building on what you just said about shanty towns, of course, you have these huge shanty towns in Nairobi, in Kenya, in Mexico, next to Mexico City, in Mumbai, in India, that you just mentioned. So according to the United Nations, you may have 2.8 billion people that need urgent housing. And we mentioned before that also in the US, and definitely, as I said, close to Ithaca, the problems you can see are very, very visible. Right. You mentioned Porto Alegre. I wanted to also go back to, for instance, Oscar Niemeyer. So there is a huge tradition of great architects that housing and affordable housing was a priority for them. And Brazil definitely has many. And you mentioned another city that is becoming or has become an example for the world. And staying in Latin America, I wanted to mention Hernando de Soto, the Peruvian economist, that argued for very long is that formalizing house ownership for the poor was crucial, so that this very informal economy could start using the property as a collateral for loans, and that way reduce poverty. So how do you think, what is your reaction to this? How do you think, how important it is to own your own house and build the rest of your finances based on that? That is quite common, or should be more common in emerging markets, and definitely in this country as well.
Yes, I mean, De Soto's The Mystery of Capital is enormously important, right? So he talks about invisible or locked up capital that can't do the things, the magic that capital usually does, because it cannot be legally unlocked. Right? So you own a dwelling, but you can't borrow against it because you don't have title. So the big debate, I think, around this is the cost of cadastral surveys, right? So ideally, what you'd like to do is come into a shanty town and say, all right, let's go. We have a sort of an emergent form of ownership here where people recognize and on a kind of a practical implicit level that like, that's your house, that's my house. And I'm not going to, just because you don't have a title deed, I'm not going to like wander into your house and, you know, eat your oranges, but we don't have that written down anywhere. So how about we just, you know, bring in some nice mapping software and try to do a cadastral survey and give people paper title deeds and record it somewhere. That's great. And I totally applaud where people can do that. The downside is it's very expensive and things move fast. One of the places that has had a really effective, most of the way solution to this is Indonesia. So Indonesian development, if you look at like a satellite map of Indonesian cities, you'll see that there's these two patterns of urban growth that are interleaved in most Indonesian cities. So there's the more formal pattern. Indonesia has been a higher than average income developing country for a long time, and so they have relatively more formal development, you know, than what you would see in India or Africa. So there's lots of formal development, apartment buildings, roads, blah blah blah. Those are all formal with title deeds, and those are typically built on what were, you know, rice fields or other fields where there was a big piece of land that could then be subdivided and relatively clear ownership. The other pattern is what's called kampungs, which are essentially villages. So these are historical villages, which were made up of very small dwellings, little twisty alleyways. And so you've got the problems of smallness. Like at a certain point, like it's very hard to do a cadastral survey where the distances involved might be like, you know, 3 meters across or something. And so like a little error is going to eat up your entire plot. And the walkways, not even roadways, the walkways in between are often just 1 meter. So you have a real challenge. And so what Indonesian authorities have done over the years, and I think there were two really positive things that other developing world governments should imitate. One is, instead of trying to judge or ignore or bulldoze the informal settlements in the kampung. So the kampungs were like traditional villages, but they grew a lot. As urbanization happened, people who had a little plot of land in the kampung would subdivide it into 6 houses or something. And the kampung would also grow outward into previously agricultural land. So they're much bigger now than they were as little villages. And they're enmeshed in the urban area. So instead of judging these or ignoring them, which is, I think, the most common governmental approach, they said, okay, let's try to improve them, but not via like coming in and making them fully formal. We'll do the bare necessity, which is trying to get some clean water in and sewage out, right? That's the biggest thing we can do. And I think sometimes we put like a payphone also in the middle of the kampung so that people had some kind of communications access. And so, you know, you start, the very first thing is, can you just like run a single clean water line into the middle of the kampung and have a spigot that everybody can use. And then eventually, I think they went house to house. And so that did two things. It created water bills. So people would pay for their water and even, I think, electricity as they became wealthy enough to afford those things. Once you have a water bill or an electricity bill, then the government started recognizing those as proof of residency and proof of ownership. And so utility bill based transactions, according to sources, you know, I'm sure this is not true everywhere in Indonesia, but you know, where people have studied it, they operate at something like a 10% discount versus formal property ownership. So there's a discount, right? There's a little bit more uncertainty there if you're, you know, transacting property for which there isn't title, but the government recognizes these utility bills as proof of residency. And that's enough to allow most of that capital to be unlocked in a sort of De Soto sense. So I think that obviously requires a little bit higher of a level of wealth than you know what you have in you know, Nairobi's slum. Which last time I was there, I don't think any houses were connected to running water, maybe electricity, and you know, so it's a lot harder if you are literally just having a shelter to sleep under. But then also there's not as much capital to unlock. So I think that's a really positive approach. There's other ones, you know, obviously every urban planner says, oh, well, what we'll do is build lots of new housing and then move all the slum dwellers into the new housing and then demolish the slum and like you can rotate. Somehow, we saw this in like Robert Moses' New York, and many developing countries. Somehow, not everybody gets rehoused, and often a very small percentage get rehoused. So I'm always skeptical of that scheme. Everyone has always said that from the beginning of time, that, oh, we're going to replace their dwellings. So we saw this in Ahmedabad, and you know, okay, you can see the housing. Certainly, some people are getting new places to live, but also the new housing is up in an apartment building. And if what you had was a place where you lived in the front and you had a bicycle, or lived in the back with a bicycle repair shop in the front, well, you can no longer have a bicycle repair shop because nobody's bringing their bicycle to the 7th story where we gave you an apartment. And so shelter isn't the same thing as property. And recognizing that, you know, poor and working class people in developing world cities are using their property in a lot of creative ways. It's not easy to improve on that if you have an entire plan. And so what you want to do is kind of work around the edges and say, all right, I can see that you don't have clean water, and I'm almost 100% sure that your life will be better if you have access to a spigot with clean water. So let's start there. Or I can see that you're walking in a mud track, and almost certainly if we lay some gravel in this mud track, that's going to be an improvement in your quality of life. So things like that, you know, might be where you should start if as a developing world mayor.
Yeah, certainly a very effective program from a cost sense, also from like an ownership sense in terms of like, yeah, by having the people, you know, once they get to that level to be able to afford those utilities, firstly, it's going to make, like you said, a very large impact on their lives. And I think secondly, you know, you also have a bit more of like kind of buy-in to actually owning the property as opposed to just being, you know, titled it for example. But like when I pay into something, it feels almost as if, you know, I've done a lot more to earn it in that sense as opposed to just, you know, being directly titled that. So I think that also helps a lot. And I think it's an excellent model for the, you know, utility usage based titleship for property. And you know, another interesting point for your research was that, you know, at least in U.S. cities, you do find that the higher cost areas tend to be also associated with higher like homeless populations. And I was just wondering, you know, firstly, what do you think explains this phenomena, and does this kind of apply in a global context?
Well, that's a great question. So yeah, so in the U.S., right, there's plenty of people who want to say, well, homelessness has nothing to do with housing costs, because people who are homeless, maybe they're just homeless because they've got mental illness for drug habits, or, you know, they're homeless because of the broken system of capitalism or whatever, and we just need to overthrow the system. But I think it's, or they're homeless because we don't do enough to support the poor. The patterns of homelessness don't map to those explanations, right? So the places where there are a lot of homeless people are not the places where drug use is the highest or mental illness is the highest. They're not the places where the government does the least to help the poor, right? Like Alabama and Mississippi have warm weather and, you know, the skimpiest welfare systems that you could ask for in the US. And yet they have basically no homelessness. And whereas like, you know, Seattle, like it's not freezing cold, but like it's pretty unpleasant in the winter to live outside. It's wet. And has a, you know, very generous, competent, left-leaning government, and yet has a much higher homeless population. And there's obviously a role for weather. Like not many people live outdoors in the winter in Minneapolis, but it's not mostly weather. It's mostly housing costs. And it's really important to distinguish individual factors from systemic factors. So like the individual factors are mental illness and drug use, and obviously not having any money. The systemic factor is the housing cost. Now we get this weird dissonance where the academics working on homelessness are virtually all bought into the idea of housing first as a anti-homelessness strategy. So the idea that you shouldn't demand that someone stop using drugs or take their mental health medication before you give them housing. But the confusing thing here is that is actually an individual, not a systemic strategy. And it may be a very good individual strategy, but it is not proven to lower homelessness rates. It is proven to help individuals who are suffering from homelessness, much the same as having schizophrenia and using cocaine are risk factors for becoming homeless. And so it's more like mental illness. It is less like housing costs. And I think that's a big disconnect, partly because there's an echo chamber in that particular branch of academia. People don't there's a lot of moralism around talking about the homeless. It's a obviously morally freighted issue, and people don't want to admit that their solution could be imperfect or could fail to address the real factor. And this is the other thing about homelessness is you think about people as homeless. Most people who experience homelessness do it fairly briefly. And so it is a flow problem. It's more like a river than a lake. And so, scooping buckets out of the river isn't going to change the river very much because it's just always getting refreshed with new inflows. And you have to think about, okay, how do we stop people from becoming water in this river? I don't know. That's now the analogy breaks down, but like you've got to think about the flow and what causes people to flow into homelessness. And this is where I did a little bit of research, mostly just because I was frustrated with the state of academia, not because I have any deep expertise here. But just looking at, okay, how do housing prices, because I think it is correct to say most people who are homeless cannot afford a room even in a relatively well-functioning housing market. That is some, right? So like there's a ridiculous number of like UCLA students who are living in their cars. They could, if they went to school in a cheaper place, Wichita or something, they would be able to afford to rent a room in a shared house. So there are certainly people for whom it is purely a money issue. But there's a lot of other people who have basically zero income, near zero ability to work. And yet they're, if they happen to have been born in Alabama, they don't live on the street. Well, what's going on? And I think it's primarily that they live with their families or with other people who care about them. And so I just dug through the American Community Survey, which is a, kind of a census type product, and looked for individuals. They don't cover the homeless in the American Community Survey. So we're not going to see homeless people directly unless they're in a long-term shelter, at which point, like, are you really homeless anyhow? So I just looked for individuals who are unmarried and had adults and had zero income or very close to zero income, basically matching the income distribution of the homeless population. And what I found is that most of them are housed. Obviously, I wouldn't see them if they weren't housed. And there's a much bigger population of people who are like that than there are of people who are actually homeless. And they live with other people. Something like a third of them live with their parents. And you really only see penniless adults living with their parents. That only really drops off at the age at which your parents have probably died. Right. So if you're 60, you're out living with your parents. Some of them own their own homes. I actually have a couple of people on my street who fit this profile. They are mentally ill. Police get called on them. It's a little weird, but they happen to own their own homes for a time when they were healthy. And so they are housing secure because of that. They just have to pay their taxes and not get their house repossessed. And they get some kind of public assistance, presumably that covers that. There's others who share housing, usually with other poor people. It's not usually with generous, affluent folks who say, oh, we'll take you in. So how does this connect to the housing price thing? If you are a parent, say you're 60 years old and you've got a kid who is unemployable and mentally ill, do you have space to have that kid live in your home? And if you live in Memphis, or somewhere are like that, you probably do. Housing prices are cheap enough. If you raised kids, you probably raised kids in a 3 or 4 bedroom home, and it's not like a big accomplishment to be able to have an extra room for your adult child to stay in. But if you live in Los Angeles, you might already be doubled up with another family. And your child who is unemployable is also probably hard to live with, right? The individual risk factors are real things. So you've got somebody who's probably hard to live with, maybe doing drugs, maybe mentally ill. And you don't really want that person like sharing your bathroom, sleeping on your couch. You'd like them to have like some of their own space so that you have a little space from them. And I think that's actually a lot of what's going on here is that the resources, there's a quote, I have no idea who said this originally, but it's been passed around in like the homelessness services discourse for a very long time. You don't become homeless when you run out of money. You become homeless when you run out of friends. And for almost all of us, if we totally lost our ability to earn money, we would not immediately go sleep in a tent on the street. We would start bouncing around with friends and family. And you can think of for yourself, like how many people would put me up if I suddenly became a basket case who was hard to live with and could not work? Who would let me stay with them for how long? right? And some of your friends might let you stay there for a week and then be like, guy, it's been a little bit. It's time for you to move on. And eventually you run out of people who have the space and the tolerance for you. That's why parents are a big deal. Like parents are enormously tolerant of their children, right? It's a mother's love, right? And recognizing that is what's keeping people housed. It's individual effort. There might be some secondary nonprofit stuff here. Like, so if you're a church that runs a ministry for people at risk of homelessness, how far does your dollar go and be able to like rent a couple houses where you can put people up? So there might be some stuff that's happening via charity there. But I think a lot of it is just private individual effort and recognizing that the reason we don't have a homeless population 10 times as large as we actually do is not mostly government aid, it's mostly private effort and people who are able to afford housing at market rates, sharing that housing with those who can't afford it. And that's something to celebrate. The homelessness, academic industry, which I don't love, as I've said, they're very negative on doubling up. They think of doubling up as primarily a problem. Obviously, lots of problems happen when people live together and we're all sinners. People get in fights. There's domestic abuse. You double up because you have problems in your life, right? Like you double up because things are hard. And they view this as a negative. And actually, like, I think my children actually could, if we had a vigorous enough school administrator, my children could be counted as homeless because we rent out rooms in our house. And so if doubling up for economic reasons is considered homelessness by the McKinney-Vento definition, which is what determines student homelessness. So the student homeless population is massive because it includes all these people who share housing. And if you share housing for non-economic reasons, then you're not supposed to be counted. But a diligent enough school administrator could stretch the definition and count my kids as homeless if they really, really wanted to. No, obviously not. They have a great home. But that attitude towards doubling up, that it's like, oh, this is terrible, and no one is fully housed until they are a totally isolated individual. It's a really odd expression of individualism, right? The idea that I don't need anybody, I'm living on my own, and the government takes care of me via a check every month. And that to me is an expression of individualism that I just don't relate to. And I've actually never lived only with my own family as an adult. I've always shared housing.
Very, very interesting last comment.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm going on.
Schemes versus
No,
scheme
not a problem.
reduce. That's what we need. Yeah. And just as a closing question,
Yeah.
we always finish our webinars with a question. Please name an emerging market and why. You mentioned some during your the conversation. Which one would you single out as a country that is making serious and interesting efforts to solve the housing problem?
So I'll mention Ethiopia. I mentioned at the beginning of this call the Urban Expansion Project, and so I don't know, what's the relationship between the government and the nonprofits that are doing this, but in I think a dozen or 24 secondary cities of Ethiopia, my friends who work on this project have done urban expansion plans, and Ethiopia's got a very large population, very rapidly urbanizing as people move off farms, essentially. And cities need to grow, and they need the delineation of basically a road grid, and then within that, rights to build, rights to do housing, business, whatever they need. And so the basic idea of these urban expansion plans is to take a little city and they'll say, okay, we think that based on population trends, there's going to be triple your population in 60 years. You need space for that, and you need infrastructure. And so don't try to build the roads right now. You don't need to triple your roads, but just lay out, this is going to be the road network. And they started with 1 kilometer spacing, and then I think they've narrowed it down to like 600 meter spacing between roads. Then there'll be lanes and side streets within that to access individual dwellings. But the idea is that you could have bus service along all those main roads, and 600 meters gives you something like, okay, so to get to the center, it's 300 meters. That was based on like, if a mother is coming home with small children and groceries from the market that she has to carry, how far is it reasonable to expect her to walk from where the bus drops her off? And so they said, okay, well, 300 meters seems about right. And so something like a 600 meter grid, and then you've got to work around topography, obviously. So it's not going to be just a perfect grid. and you try to, you've got these existing cities, they have some like intercity roads that come out from them. And so you're working around the existing villages and existing roadways to create some kind of loose grid. And then if those are enforced, now it could be that this is just another planning effort that's ignored. I think that's reasonably likely, and that's the risk. But if the local mayors are vigorous enough, then they can say, no, please develop your land. But also when you do, we're going to take this corridor via eminent domain, whatever the local equivalent is. We're going to take this corridor because that's going to be the road. And that raises your property value, right? If your piece of agricultural property is going to have, private minibuses running up and down, carrying people to the city center, it's much more valuable than if it's just alleyways kind of all the way into the city. And so hopefully that will be the kind of urban expansion plan that allows people to build their own lives as they urbanize.
Well, that's an excellent development. Very heartening to hear that. But yeah, that's all the time we have for today's episode. I really appreciate you coming on the program, Salim, for the Canizares Center for Emerging Markets and the Cornell Emerging Markets Institute Club. This is Beating Sisyphus. Thank you all very much for watching.